In this lecture, I'm going to take you through the labelling theory of crime, which comes from an interactionist viewpoint. And we're going to be looking at what they consider the role of agents of social control and the social construction of crime and deviance, which we have covered previously, but we're going to go back over. We're going to look at the labelling process in relation to crime, and then the consequences that labelling can have on crime, as well as evaluating the usefulness of labelling theory when it comes to explaining criminal activity. So we'll start off by looking again at that social construction of crime. And Becker, who's one of the key labelling theorists, states that when it comes to criminal behaviour, deviant behaviour, or anything like that, it's not the behaviour that is wrong unless somebody else sees it as wrong. So crime isn't about what you do, it is about how others see the action that you do. And Becker is quoted as saying, "An act only becomes deviant when others perceive and define it as such, and whether or not a label of deviant is applied will depend on the social reaction." So what he's saying here is that no act in and of itself is inherently criminal or inherently deviant. It's society and the people within society that determine whether or not something is criminal or deviant. So if we go back over that idea of the social construction of crime and deviance, the ways in which society determines, or the ways that we can see that crime is a social construction, the fluidity of crime. We've talked about contextual social construction. So what is criminal or deviant in one context isn't necessarily criminal or deviant in another context. For example, wearing a bikini at the beach, wearing Speedos at the beach, or if you really want to, and I don't know why you would, but a mankini at a beach, acceptable. I'm still not sure about the mankini thing, but each their own. However, if somebody was to walk around the town centre or turn up to school wearing a bikini or a mankini or just a pair of Speedos, then that would be considered deviant behaviour and may even be considered indecent exposure, which is a criminal act. The next one we talked about was cultural differences, or how culture can shape criminal and deviant activity, or what is considered criminal or deviant activity. So for example, in certain countries, drinking alcohol is just illegal. In the UK, the drinking of alcohol is legal if you're over the age of 18, or the buying of alcohol is legal over the age of 18. In some cultures, adultery is still illegal. In the UK, it's considered deviant. It's not something you should do, but in some countries it can lead to prison time. It can lead to execution, particularly if you're female. We've then got the historical social construction and how crime and deviant behaviour changes over time. For example, what was once criminal, i.e. homosexuality, becomes legal and non-deviant. What was once legal and considered normal behaviour, the use of opioids, becomes illegal. In the 1800s, it wasn't unheard of for mothers to be prescribed small amounts of cocaine to subdue their children, to look after their children, and it would be rubbed on their gums if they were teething. Nowadays, you would have your child taken away from you. And the final one is the generational. What is considered criminal or deviant at a younger age or a certain age may not be at another. This is more to do with deviance than criminality. But for example, watching an 80-year-old in a nightclub on a Friday or Saturday night might be considered a little bit odd. Things such as age restrictions. Now, the thing with age restrictions to remember is it's not the person under the age that has broken the law. It's the person giving the young person access. So if you're under 18 and you are drinking alcohol, the person who has provided you with that alcohol, depending on the circumstance, is the one that has broken the law, not the under 18. But all of these things show that what is criminal and what is deviant isn't set in stone. It is flexible. It is a social construction. So who is it that determines what is criminal and what is deviant? Well, it's people called moral entrepreneurs. They're the ones who determine what is and is not acceptable in society. And essentially these are the ruling class, the government, lawmakers, people with social status and social power. So that might be in modern society, we might be looking at people such as celebrities, people who hold influence over people. Even like social media influencers to a certain extent have an element of moral entrepreneurship about them. They are the ones that determine what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what is not within society. So when we're talking about crime and deviance, and when we're talking about the labelling theory of crime and deviance, it's important that we remember that they are very much of the view that crime and deviance is a social construction, and that is going to then play into their theory. So we're going to start off with talking about the process of labelling, and a lot of this comes from a key thinker called Lemert. And yes, I do realise his picture is a little bit dodgy. It's not the worst one of the lot. Lemert argues that whether or not something becomes deviant depends on whether it's primary or secondary. So when a criminal or deviant act is committed, in terms of primary deviance, this is when nobody sees that you've done it. You know that you've done something you shouldn't have done. You know that it's against the law. You know that it's not socially acceptable, but nobody else has seen it, so nobody else knows. Therefore, no label is attached. Remember, labelling theory, the attachment of labels is external to the individual, not internal. So unless there's somebody else to witness the act, to witness you've done something you shouldn't have done, there is no label. There is no attachment of the label. For example, driving down the A11, look down your speedometer and you're doing 110. Strangely easy to do, although both illegal and deviant. But if there's nobody else on the road, there's nobody else to give you that label. If I'm driving along the A11 and somebody whizzes past me going over 100 miles an hour, I'm going to give that driver a label. Maybe it's something that is less than flattering, but I might also label them as a dangerous driver. But if I'm not there to see it, that label cannot be attached. So then we get to secondary deviance, and this is where the act is actually witnessed, where somebody else sees that you have done something criminal or you have done something deviant. When it is witnessed, a label is then attached to that person. So we're talking here, somebody's done something criminal, they've been caught by the police, they've been prosecuted, they've been labelled with the label of criminal. With that label, society then rejects that person, they ostracise them. We don't want criminals as part of our society, so we don't want you. Because they have been rejected by society, they then reject society themselves. They internalise that label of criminal and are kind of like, well, if that's how you see me, that's how I'm going to act. Okay. Remember as well that when a person is rejected by society, their access to certain social needs is also cut off. It is really, really hard for somebody with a criminal record or with the label of criminal to get a job, a legitimate job, to get a housing, to make friends, to be accepted within society. And when people are not accepted, they turn their back and kind of go, well, if you don't want me, we'll sod you then. I don't want you either. And this can then lead into a cycle of deviant career, whereby a person is labelled, ostracised, rejected society. If you don't want me in society, well, I'm not going to follow your society's rules. And that begins that spiral, that cycle of deviant career. So what happens once that label has been attached? So we're talking here about the consequences of the attachments of secondary deviance. Well, Cicerel, and I'm probably horribly mispronouncing that, Cicourel, talks about typifications. Now, I know we've come across that term before when we talked about phenomenology. This is a different use of the term. So Cicerel, and yes, his picture is even more creepy than Lemert's, says that labels create typifications. And what he means by that is they create a common sense idea of what a criminal looks like. And they're kind of like the idea that we think of a criminal as being male, 20s, perhaps scruffy looking, poor, drug addict, alcohol addiction, things like that. So what the labels create is these typifications. And when you've got these typifications, it leads to selective law enforcement. So we can see a link here to Marxist theory and neo-Marxist theory. And what Cicerel says is when a group is labelled as criminal or deviant, the police are much more likely to focus on that group and reinforce the stereotype of them being criminal, because they're more likely to be stop and searched or arrested or taken in for questioning, because they are part of that stereotype, which then leads to more arrests, which reinforces the stereotype. And this is something we see quite often, particularly with ethnic minorities, where there's this typification around certain ethnic groups being more criminal than others, and therefore they are targeted by the police. They're stopped. Black teenage boys are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white teenage boy, because they're more likely to be stopped and searched. They're more likely to be found with something they shouldn't have on them, which leads to their arrest, which reinforces that stereotype. So what we can see here is the labelling that's been attached to that particular group has then led to selective law enforcement, targeted policing, and the reinforcement of the stereotype. Another consequence of labelling comes from Jock Young, and we've come across Jock Young before. He was involved in the neo-Marxist theory of crime, and he talks about the deviancy amplification spiral and links it to moral panics. And what Jock Young says is that labels, when we give somebody the label of a criminal, or a group the label of a criminal, they become a folk devil. And this is a group or person who, just by the nature of who they are, or the group that they belong to, are considered deviant. They personally may not have done anything, but because they are part of a group, they are considered deviant. And this can then create a moral panic surrounding that group and lead and generate more crime. And Jock Young referred to this as the deviancy amplification spiral. And he used an example of Notting Hill marijuana smokers in the 1960s and 1970s as an example of this. So what he said in his study, what it was referred to as the drug takers of Notting Hill. And when we're talking about drug takers here, he was actually looking at marijuana smokers initially. So at the beginning, the police arrest marijuana smokers for minor offences. maybe some petty theft or disorderly conduct, things like that. This then led to a media sensationalization. Is that a word? It is now. Where the media blow the whole thing out of proportion and create this folk devil of drug takers in Notting Hill, of marijuana being a gateway drug to harder substances and criminal activity. So people start getting very worried about these drug takers. They start getting onto the police and suggesting to the police that they need to do something about it. So the police do. The police crack down even harder on them. They target this particular group in order to show that they are responding to this moral panic that has been generated by the media. By cracking down on these people, it pushes them underground. It creates a underground subculture, if you like, which raises suspicion of the police, pushes the price of drugs up, and causes the police to crack down more harshly. Now, what Jock Young pointed out here was that prior to this moral panic surrounding marijuana users, there was the drug taking was something that you did in your own home with your friends, like having a glass of wine. Yes, it was illegal, but it was acceptable illegality almost. You knew who you could get your marijuana from. It was something that was done amongst friends. But once this moral panic started and it started pushing these the marijuana smokers to go underground, so to speak, not literally, metaphorically, they started getting really suspicious of the dealers, the people that they would buy the marijuana from, just in case they were police officers undercover. So it became that the dealers could push the price up because the users would only buy drugs from dealers that they knew. But also, because the prices were going up, it led some of these marijuana users to more criminal activity to get the money to pay for the drugs. Or it would push them to other types of drugs because they were more easily available, they were more widely available. And this, of course, led to things such as resisting arrest, more deviance, more criminal activity, and it kind of spirals down into a more criminal, deviant subculture. So going from what was initially something you did with your friends in your own home, just kind of having a little bit of fun, to something that was nasty and perverted and underground and made you a social pariah. So the label of drug user or drug taker took on this very negative view and pushed the whole culture from being something that was quite easygoing, quite light. Yes, it was illegal, to something that was a lot darker and a lot more dangerous. So one of the key criticisms of labelling theory is an internal criticism which comes from Braithwaite. Now, yes, I know he looks a bit like Lamert, but they are different people and they are different photographs. Braithwaite argues that labelling theory focuses on the negative side of labelling and the labelling of an individual. It states that labelling can have a positive as well as negative effect depending on the type of shaming employed. Now this we can link back to what we talked about in education and labelling in education, whereby labelling into a positive or pro-school subculture can lead to educational achievement or good levels of educational achievement, whereas negative labeling can lead to an anti-school subculture and educational underachievement. This same sort of process, and that's a really good synoptic link for you there, this similar type of process can happen with criminal and deviant activity. So Braithwaite argues that if you're using reintegrative shaming as part of your system, you are less likely to have a deviancy amplification spiral. And what he means by reintegrative shaming is that you're not labeling the person as being criminal or deviant. What they did was criminal or deviant, and that leads to less chance of ostracization, because it's not you that you did something horrible, or you did something criminal, you did something that we think is a bit weird, but it's not you, it's what you did that was the problem. So that allows people to rejoin society, to be seen as, yeah, you did something weird or horrible or criminal, but you as a person are not criminal, horrible or weird. Okay. Whereas if you employ what's called disintegrative shaming, where you're labeling the individual, it forces that kind of ostracization and marginalization that leads into a deviancy amplification spiral, and therefore a deviant career. With disintegrative shaming, you are labeling the person. You are a criminal. You are a deviant. You are weird. Okay? And therefore, we don't want you in our society. You don't fit in our society. However, so what Braithwaite said is that the general labeling theory is very, very negative and focuses on the negative and ignores the fact that it can still have positive outcomes. It just depends on how you label the act, the person, the situation. And if we continue looking at evaluation from an external viewpoint, labeling theory can be seen as useful because it really does emphasize that social construction of crime and deviance. It really shows us that what we consider criminal, what we consider deviant, despite there being some commonalities throughout the world, for example, don't kill people, murder is bad, no matter what country you're in, that is a creation of society. It is not natural law, it's not a natural phenomena. It also helps us to identify and explain the role of the powerful, those moral entrepreneurs, in determining what is criminal and what is deviant. And this kind of backs up Marxist theory, and you can kind of see this within the neo-Marxist theory, in that the rich and powerful use this role of moral entrepreneur in order to create who are the folk devils, if you like, and that can then prevent the revolution that prevents the overthrow of capitalism. And finally, it does show us how deviant careers, criminal careers, can be established. Somebody does something minor, criminal, yeah, still criminal, or deviant or whatever, but that then escalates into a criminal career, a deviant career, because that label has been attached to them, they've internalized it, and it has become part of their master status. So in some ways, labeling theory can be really useful in helping to explain crime in society and the continuation of crime in society. However, it is deterministic. Remember, labeling is done externally. You don't label yourself as a criminal. Somebody else does that to you, which means that you don't have free will. It's not my fault I'm a criminal. Somebody told me I was, and I've kind of accepted that and then built on that. Okay. So it is deterministic. And because it is deterministic, the deviant and the criminal becomes victimized in the sense that they are not to blame for their behavior. If you hadn't labeled me as a criminal, I wouldn't then have continued with this criminal behavior. Okay. And it doesn't explain why people commit the original deviance. It says that the label is attached when you do something bad or you do something criminal and somebody sees you, and the label is attached. But why did you do it in the first place? Why did you murder that person? Why did you do 110 down the A11? Why did you take drugs? So it doesn't explain that side of the equation, so to speak. And finally, it doesn't explain where the stereotypes come from. It does to a little bit, but the stereotypes have to be there in the first place for the label to be attached to the group. But where did the stereotype come from in the first place in order for it to be applied to a group? So whether or not labeling theory is useful is up to you to decide. But a lot of the problem with labeling theory is this idea that crime and deviance is socially constructed. You own, and it's the attachment of the label by an external person or group that causes the continuation of criminal activity.